Before continuing, leave the like, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end, because the details that come now are almost never explained in this way. The rapture of Paul to the third heaven. For 14 years, Paul kept a secret. The man who wrote 13 letters to the Christian world, who debated with philosophers in Athens, who faced emperors and Sanhedrins, remained in absolute silence regarding the most extraordinary experience of his life. He had seen the third heaven. He had heard words that no human being ever repeated, and even so he kept silent. The question is not what he saw. The question is, why did he never want to tell? The answer will change the way you understand spiritual experiences. The only direct account of this experience appears in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. And even there, Paul does not speak of himself in the first person. He writes as if describing another man. I know a man in Christ who, 14 years ago, was caught up to the third heaven. This distancing is not false modesty. It is protection. Paul knew that what he lived was too great to be treated as a personal trophy. And he knew also that the moment he transformed the experience into an argument of authority, it would lose exactly that which made it sacred. But before understanding what he saw, you need to understand when this happened and why the timing matters. Paul writes this letter around the year 55 or 56 after Christ. If the rapture happened 14 years prior, we are speaking of something that occurred between the years 40 and 42. In this era, Paul had already been converted on the road to Damascus, had already spent 3 years in the desert of Arabia in solitary preparation, had already begun his missionary journeys through the Mediterranean world. He was not a novice. He was an apostle in intense formation. And it was exactly in this period, when God was molding the man who would write almost half of the New Testament, that the heaven opened. Literally. But what does it mean exactly to be caught up to the third heaven? In the Jewish cosmology of the first century, the heavens were not a vague metaphor nor a figure of speech. There existed a precise structure, recognized by all the scholars and rabbis of the time. The first heaven was the terrestrial atmosphere, the space where birds fly, where clouds form, where the wind circulates and rain originates. The second heaven was the cosmic firmament, the region of the celestial bodies, of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, the space that today we call the universe. The third heaven was the place of God's habitation, not a symbol, not an abstract idea, a real domain separated from physical creation, where the divine presence manifests without veil, without barrier, without mediation. Paul uses another name for this place. He calls it paradise. And here the language becomes even more charged with meaning. The Greek term is paradisos, derived from ancient Persian, and originally described the walled gardens of the Persian kings. A protected space, cultivated, reserved for very few privileged ones. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek in the version known as the Septuagint, this word was used to describe the Garden of Eden. By saying he was taken to paradise, Paul is stating that he was in the place where God dwells in fullness, the same type of presence that Adam knew before the fall. Consider the dimension of what is being said. A man born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, in present-day Turkey, educated at the feet of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, a zealous ex-Pharisee, ex-persecutor of the church, responsible for imprisoning Christians and voting for the death of men like Stephen, was transported to the most sacred environment of the universe. Not by merit, not by learned spiritual technique, not by years of asceticism or prolonged fasting or repetition of mantras. It was a sovereign action of God. Paul makes this absolutely clear by admitting that he does not even know how it happened. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. This phrase destroys any attempt to transform the rapture into a reproducible method. Paul, the man who lived the experience, confesses total ignorance regarding the mechanism. He does not know if he was taken physically or if only his consciousness crossed dimensions that the human mind cannot process. And he does not try to guess. He does not speculate. He does not create theory. He simply accepts the limit of his own understanding and attributes complete knowledge only to God. This should silence many people who today claim to know exactly how the spiritual world functions. But here comes the part that no one expects, the part that transforms the entire narrative. What did Paul see there? What did he hear? This is the question everyone asks, and the biblical answer is disconcerting. Instead of opening a window to heaven, the text closes a door. Paul states that he heard ineffable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. The Greek term for ineffable is areta, which literally means something that cannot be said, something that human language does not contain. And the word translated as lawful carries legal weight, almost juridical. It is not a matter of linguistic incapacity. Paul is not saying that words are lacking in the human vocabulary to describe what he heard. He is saying that there exists an active prohibition. To reveal that would cause damage. Observe what this implies. The revelation of the third heaven was not given for public consumption. It was not material for preaching in squares. It was not content to strengthen the faith of others through satisfied curiosity. It was something destined exclusively for the interior formation of Paul himself. God showed him enough to sustain him in the following decades of brutal suffering, but did not authorize him to transform this into a spectacle for the masses. And Paul obeyed for 14 whole years. During this time, he planted churches in Asia Minor, crossed the Aegean Sea several times, faced riots in Ephesus where he was almost torn apart by a furious crowd, was stoned in Lystra and left for dead, expelled from Thessalonica by hostile authorities, ridiculed in Athens by the philosophers of the Areopagus, imprisoned in Philippi together with Silas. In none of these moments did he use the experience of the third heaven as an argument of authority. In none of his previous letters does he even mention the subject. When he writes to the Galatians about his apostolic authority, he does not cite the rapture. When he defends his ministry to the Corinthians in the first letter, he does not touch on the theme. Absolute silence. Then why does he finally speak? Because he was forced, and the context explains everything. 2 Corinthians is a letter of deep crisis. False apostles had arrived at the Church of Corinth and were attacking Paul's credibility with a specific and effective strategy. They boasted of spectacular visions, of exclusive revelations, of extraordinary spiritual experiences that supposedly proved their superiority. And they used this to diminish Paul, to suggest that he was inferior, less spiritual, less anointed, less connected with heaven. The church was being seduced by this discourse of spiritual power. Paul responds, but the way he responds is as important as the content of the response. He calls what he is about to do madness. He uses the Greek word aphrosine, which means senselessness, lack of judgment, foolishness. He knows that entering the game of spiritual comparisons is dangerous. He knows that boasting of visions is exactly the opposite of what the gospel of the cross teaches. But the pastoral situation demands that he speak. So he speaks. And even so, he makes a point of not using the first person directly. I know a man in Christ. It is Paul speaking of himself, but refusing to transform the experience into public identity. He does not want to be known as the man who went to heaven. He wants to be known as a servant of Christ crucified. The difference is abysmal. And then comes the detail that changes everything. The detail that almost everyone ignores when reading this passage. The detail that separates Paul from everyone who today claims to have visited heaven. Paul did not leave the third heaven lighter. He left heavier. He states that, because of the greatness of the revelations, he received a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him continuously, so that he would not exalt himself. The Greek word for thorn is skolops, which can mean a pointed stake or a deep splinter. It was something that caused continuous, persistent pain, impossible to ignore or forget. Something that would accompany him for the rest of his life as a permanent reminder. The Bible does not reveal the exact nature of this thorn. Over 2,000 years, scholars and theologians have suggested dozens of possibilities. Some believe it was a debilitating physical disease, perhaps severe vision problems. Since Paul mentions in Galatians that he wrote with large letters by his own hand, and that the Galatians would have plucked out their own eyes to give them to him. Others suggest epilepsy, chronic malaria contracted in the swampy regions of Asia Minor, or severe migraines that left him incapacitated for whole days. There are those who propose it was a spiritual affliction, persistent temptations that did not cease, regular demonic attacks, constant inner torment. And there are still those who interpret it as relentless external persecution, opposition that never gave a truce, enemies who followed him from city to city. No one knows for certain. And perhaps that is exactly the point. What we know with absolute certainty is the declared purpose. The thorn existed to keep Paul dependent. The glory of what he saw was so intense, so overwhelming, that without a counterweight of suffering it could destroy him from the inside. Through pride, the revelation of heaven needed to be balanced with pain on earth. Think about this for a moment. Let this truth penetrate. Some blessings are too dangerous to be carried without suffering. Paul did not accept this passively. He fought. He prayed. 3 times he asked the Lord to remove the thorn. 3 times. The number is not casual nor random. In Jewish culture, 3 repetitions indicated complete persistence. A formal request exhausted, supplication taken to the maximum limit. Paul did not pray once and give up resigned. He insisted. He cried out. He wanted relief desperately. He wanted the pain to stop at once. The answer was no. But it came accompanied by a phrase that reorganized all Pauline theology regarding power and weakness. A phrase that echoes until today, in hospitals, in prisons, in deathbeds, in destroyed marriages, in terminal diagnoses, in bankruptcies, in interminable mournings. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God did not remove the pain. God offered something infinitely greater. He offered the transforming revelation that divine strength does not operate despite human fragility, but through it. The power of God does not need strong and self-sufficient people. It needs broken people who recognize their total dependence. How does this connect with what Paul saw in the third heaven? Apparently, what he heard there was not a promise of escape from earthly suffering. It was not a guarantee of an easy and prosperous life. It was not a revelation of spiritual shortcuts to avoid pain. What Paul received was a vision so clear of future glory that present pain completely lost the power to destroy him. He did not become immune to suffering. He became capable of traversing it without giving up. And this changes absolutely everything. In Romans 8, Paul writes one of the most well-known phrases of all his letters. I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Now you know where this unshakable conviction came from. It was not abstract theory. It was not theological speculation from an office. It was direct and personal experience. Paul had seen the glory. He had been there. And he knew, by direct observation, that no earthly pain came even close to what awaited him. But the proof of this conviction is not in Paul's words. It is in the brutal life he lived afterward. After the rapture, Paul's life did not get easier. It became dramatically more intense. In 2 Corinthians 11, he lists what he faced in the following years, and the description is a catalogue of horrors that would leave any modern person in shock. 5 times he received from the Jews 40 stripes minus 1. 40 minus 1 means 39 blows. Jewish law limited it to 40 because above that there was a real risk of death. The scourge used was not a common simple leather whip. It was made of leather strips with pieces of bone or metal at the tips, designed to cause maximum damage. Each blow tore the skin, ripped out flesh, left permanent scars that never disappeared. Paul received this punishment 5 times on different occasions. 195 blows in total, just from the Jews. 3 times he was beaten with rods by the Romans. This was the official Roman punishment, applied with hard wooden sticks on the back, on the legs, sometimes on the face. There was no legal limit of blows. The punishment continued until the officer in charge decided to stop. Paul went through this 3 times, each time without knowing if he would survive. Once he was stoned until given up for dead. This happened in Lystra, a city of Lycaonia, where the enraged crowd attacked him with stones, dragged him outside the city walls and abandoned him as a corpse. Think of the scene. Stones being hurled against his body from all sides, bones breaking under the impact, blood flowing from multiple wounds, and afterwards being dragged along the dirt ground like a dead animal. The disciples found him, and he simply got up and went back into the city the next day. 3 times he suffered shipwreck on the high seas. The Mediterranean in the 1st century was dangerous territory. Storms arose without prior warning. Wooden ships sank with frightening frequency. Paul was in 3 of these maritime disasters even before writing this letter. In one of them, he spent a night and a whole day adrift in the open sea, clinging to wooden wreckage, waiting for rescue that had no guarantee of coming. Alone with the waves and the sharks, he was in constant dangers of treacherous rivers that he needed to cross, dangers of robbers who infested the Roman roads, dangers from Jewish compatriots who wanted to kill him as a traitor, dangers from Gentiles who saw him as a disturber of the order, danger in the big city, danger in the isolated desert, danger on the open sea, danger among false brothers who feigned friendship to later betray him. He worked with his own hands making tents so as not to be a financial burden to anyone. He spent nights without sleep, whether working, whether praying, whether fleeing. He faced hunger when there was no food. He faced thirst when there was no water. He endured cutting cold when there was no adequate shelter. He experienced nakedness when his clothes were taken or destroyed. Paul's body was a living map of overlapping scars, and even so, he continued, without stopping, without giving up, without complaining. Why? What makes a man endure all this without abandoning the mission? The answer lies in the 3rd heaven. Paul knew where he was going. He had seen with his own eyes, or with his own consciousness, or in some mysterious way that he himself could not explain in human words. But he had seen, and this vision functioned as an invisible and unshakable anchor that kept him firm while the whole world tried to destroy him. The 3rd heaven did not remove Paul from earthly suffering. It gave eternal meaning to suffering. It transformed every lash into an investment for eternity, every imprisonment into preparation for glory, every scar into concrete evidence that future glory was worth absolutely any present price. In Philippians, a letter written years later from a damp and dark Roman cell, Paul summarizes his perspective on life with a phrase that only makes complete sense after you understand the rapture. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He was not being poetic or dramatic. He was being absolutely literal. Death was not a loss to be feared. It was a door to be crossed, and he had already seen what was waiting on the other side of that door. But there is still another crucial element that needs to be considered, perhaps the most important of all for our generation. Paul's silence regarding the visual details of the 3rd heaven is not merely obedience to a divine prohibition. It is intentional pedagogy. He is teaching something fundamental through what he chooses not to say. To mention what Paul could have done if he wanted. If he desired, he could have built an entire career on top of this unique experience. He could have written a bestseller book detailing the colors of heaven, the sounds of paradise, the appearance of the angels, the structure of the divine throne, the conversations he had, the revelations he received. In the 1st century, this type of apocalyptic literature existed and had enormous popular success. Jewish apocalypses were full of elaborate visions of the spiritual world with vivid descriptions. The Book of Enoch described celestial travels in impressive detail. The Testaments of the 12 patriarchs offered revelations from the beyond. The Ascension of Isaiah narrated journeys through the 7 heavens with extraordinary visual richness. Paul knew this literary tradition very well. He was a highly educated Pharisee. He had studied these texts since his youth, and he completely rejected this path. He offers no visual description whatsoever of the 3rd heaven. He does not mention colors. He does not speak of a throne, of seraphim flying, of streets of gold, of gates of pearl, of rivers of crystal, of trees, of life. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The man who was in paradise refuses terminally to satisfy human curiosity about the appearance of the place. This is a powerful theological declaration in itself. Heaven was not revealed for the spiritual entertainment of the curious. It is not a celestial tourist destination that can be anticipated by detailed descriptions. It is a sacred reality that can only be truly known by personal presence. Paul protects this reality by not reducing it to consumable images for the masses. He understood something that the majority ignores completely. The moment you transform heaven into a public spectacle, you profane it. And this poses a deeply uncomfortable question for contemporary Christian culture. How many books have already been written by people who claim to have visited heaven in near-death experiences and returned with detailed descriptions to sell millions of copies? How many Hollywood movies, how many Netflix documentaries, how many public testimonies in megachurches revolve around experiences where someone supposedly saw radiant angels, met deceased relatives in flowery fields, walked through golden landscapes of indescribable beauty, talked face-to-face with Jesus, and returned to tell everything in world tours and prime-time television programs? Paul had the most well-documented and most authorized experience of rapture in the entire Bible. He wrote about it under direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And he chose absolute silence regarding the details. This does not necessarily mean that all other reported experiences are automatically false or invented. It means that Paul's attitude towards celestial revelation is radically different from the attitude that has become popular and lucrative in our days. He did not return from heaven wanting to tell everyone. He returned wanting to serve in silence. He did not seek spotlights and interviews. He sought anonymous obedience. He did not monetize the vision in books and lectures. He carried the thorn in the flesh, and this is perhaps the greatest teaching of the entire episode for our generation, obsessed with spectacular experiences. Truly authentic spiritual experiences do not produce celebrities. They produce servants. They do not inflate the human ego. They break it completely. They do not generate autonomy and proud independence. They generate absolute and humble dependence on God. Paul did not leave the third heaven thinking that now he had special authority to teach exclusive secrets about the spiritual world. He left knowing that he needed a painful thorn in the flesh so as not to destroy himself with spiritual pride. There is a phrase in 2 Corinthians 12 that summarizes this entire paradoxical dynamic. A phrase that seems an absurd contradiction, but is a precise description of spiritual reality. When I am weak, then am I strong. The supernatural strength that sustained Paul for more than 3 decades of brutal ministry was not human. It was not impressive natural resilience. It was not a strong and determined personality. It was pure divine grace operating in a completely broken vessel. And the most broken vessel of all was precisely the man who had seen more than any other living human being. The rapture of Paul to the third heaven is not an invitation to curiosity about what heaven is like. It is an invitation to persistent faithfulness on earth. It shows that it is possible to know future glory and yet remain fully present and engaged in current suffering. It shows that profound spiritual revelation does not eliminate daily trial. It shows that the way up passes necessarily through the cross down here. There is no shortcut, there is no magic formula, there is no experience that delivers you from the narrow path. When Paul was finally executed in Rome, probably by beheading with a sword during the reign of the Emperor Nero, around the year 64 to 67 after Christ, he did not die as a frustrated, embittered man or one defeated by the system. He died as someone who knew exactly where he was going next. The last letter we have from him, 2 Timothy, was written from a damp, cold and dark Roman dungeon while he awaited the final sentence of death, and it contains the most serene and confident phrase that a condemned man has ever written in human history. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. No doubt, no fear, no complaint, no regret. The third heaven was not abstract theory for Paul. It was living memory, a memory that sustained every painful step of a life that, by human standards of success, was marked by failure after failure. Repeated imprisonments, constant rejections, churches he founded turning against him, friends who abandoned him in the most difficult moment when he needed them most, diseases that were not healed despite 3 sincere prayers, and even so, in the absolute end, unshakable confidence that it was all completely worth it. This radically changes the way you should read Paul from here on. Every letter, every elaborated theological argument, every practical exhortation for the day-to-day was written by a man who had seen what no other living human being had seen, and who deliberately chose not to speak about the details. Paul's humility was not a calculated performance to impress other Christians. It was an inevitable and natural consequence of what he had experienced. He, who truly knows the glory of God face to face, does not need to exhibit it to anyone. It suffices to live silently in its light. The rapture did not transform Paul into a lighter and more carefree man. It transformed him into an incomparably firmer and more unshakable man. After seeing what he saw, he did not build a theology of escape and prosperity, but a theology of resistance and the cross. Heaven did not distance him from the earthly cross. It tied him definitively to it. Imprisonments, stripes, shipwrecks, stonings, betrayals, none of this diminished his conviction for even a second. Because he who truly sees the glory does not flee from present suffering, he merely understands that it has an expiration date. And perhaps that is exactly what Paul learned in the ineffable words of the third heaven. Not a tourist map of paradise, not a detailed list of celestial rewards, not descriptions of mansions or golden streets to satisfy curiosity, but a silent, deep, unshakable certainty that present pain does not compare absolutely with what comes after. This phrase, by the way, appears in Romans chapter 8, and now you know exactly where it came from. Paul's silence is not weakness nor incapacity. It is sacred protection. Some revelations do not exist to feed insatiable human curiosity. They exist to sustain faithful obedience when no one else is looking.